Hey crew, it's Pitt and I am back with some more Esoterica. Today we're going to be diving back into the work of Mrs. Helena Blavatsky. This is Isis Unveiled. We are in Part 2, Chapter 1, Part 2. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It's not the format for everyone, but some people seem to find enjoyment in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box below, along with the original source materials, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things I do. A particular note today is almost certainly going to be the unconventional Bible study. 161 videos where I detail why I left Christianity, and many of those points are probably going to be brought up as we go along. We're also still on my coffee, so y'all pardon me as I sip along as we continue. But if science has unintentionally helped the progress of the occult phenomena, the latter have reciprocally aided science herself, until the days when newly reincarnated philosophy boldly claimed its place in the world. There had been but few scholars who had undertaken the difficult task of studying comparative theology. This science occupies a domain heretofore penetrated by few explorers. The necessity which it involved of being well acquainted with the dead languages necessarily limited the number of students. Besides, there was less popular need for it so long as people could not replace the Christian orthodoxy by something more tangible. It is one of the most undeniable facts of psychology that the average man can as little exist out of a religious element of some kind as a fish out of the water. The voice of truth, a voice stronger than the voice of the mightiest thunder, speaks to the inner man in the 19th century of the Christian era, as it spoke in the corresponding century BC. It is a useless and unprofitable task to offer humanity the choice between a future life and annihilation. The only chance that remains for those friends of human progress who seek to establish for the good of mankind a faith henceforth stripped entirely of superstition and dogmatic fetters is to address them in the words of Yeshua. Choose ye this day whom ye will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the God of the Amorites, in whose land ye dwell. I choose neither one of those. The science of religion, wrote Max Muller in 1860, is only just the beginning. During the last 50 years, the authentic documents of the most important religions in the world have been recovered in the most unexpected and miraculous manner. We have now before us the canonical books of Buddhism. The Zend Avesta of Zoroaster is no longer a sealed book, and the hymns of the Rig Veda have revealed a state of religions anterior to the first beginnings of that mythology, which in Homer and Hesiod stands before us as a moldering ruin. In their insatiable desire to extend their dominion of blind faith, the early architects of Christian theology had been forced to conceal, as much as was possible, the true sources of the same. To this end, they are said to have burned or otherwise destroyed all the original manuscripts on the Kabbalah, magic, and occult sciences upon which they could lay their hands. They ignorantly supposed that the most dangerous writings of this class had perished with the last Gnostic. But someday they may discover their mistake. Other authentic and as important documents will perhaps reappear in a most unexpected and almost miraculous manner. There are strange traditions current in various parts of the East, on Mount Athos and in the desert of Nitria, for instance, among certain monks and with learned rabbis in Palestine who pass their lives in commenting upon the Talmud. They say that not all the rolls and manuscripts reported in history to have been burned by Caesar, by the Christian mob in 389, and by the Arab general Amru, perished, as it is commonly believed. And the story they tell is the following. At the time of the contest for the throne in 51 BC between Cleopatra and her brother Dionysus Ptolemy, the Bruchian, which contained over 700,000 rolls, all bound in wood and fireproof parchment, was undergoing repairs, and a great portion of the original manuscripts, considered among the most precious and which were not duplicated, were stored away in the house of one of the librarians. As the fire which consumed the rest but was the result of the accident, no precautions had been taken at the time. But, they add, that several hours passed between the burnings of the fleet, set on fire by Caesar's order, and the moment when the first building situated near the harbor caught fire in their turn, and that all the librarians, aided by several hundred slaves attached to the museum, succeeded in saving the most precious of the rolls. So perfect and solid was the fabric of the parchment that, while in some rolls the inner pages and the wood binding were reduced to ashes, of others the parchment binding remained unscorched. These particulars were all written out in Greek, Latin, and the Chaldeo-Syriac dialect by a young man named Theodius, one of the scribes employed in the museum. One of these manuscripts is alleged to have been preserved till now in a Greek convent, and the person who narrated the tradition to us has seen it himself. He said that many more will see it and learn where to look for important documents, when a certain prophecy will be fulfilled, adding that most of these works could be found in Tartary and India. The monk showed us a copy of the original, which, of course, we could read but poorly, as we claim but little erudition in the matter of dead languages. But we were so particularly struck by the vivid and picturesque translation of the Holy Father that we perfectly remember some curious paragraphs, which run, as far as we can recall them, as follows. When the Queen of the Sun, Cleopatra, was brought back to the half-ruined city after the fire had devoured the glory of the world, and when she saw the mountains of books, or rolls, covering the half-consumed steps of the estrada, when she perceived that the inside was gone, and the indestructible covers alone remained, she wept in rage and fury, and cursed the meanness of her fathers, who had grudged the cost of the real pergamos for the inside as well as the outside of the precious rolls. Further, our author, Theodius, indulges in a joke at the expense of the queen for believing that nearly all the library was burned, when in fact hundreds and thousands of the choicest books were safely stored in his own house and those of the other scribes, librarians, students, and philosophers. No more do sundry very learned Copts, scattered all over the East in Asia Minor, Egypt, and Palestine, believe in the total destruction of the subsequent libraries. For instance, they say that out of the library of Attalus III of Pergamus, presented by Antony to Cleopatra, not a volume was destroyed. At that time, according to their assertions, from the moment that the Christians began to gain power in Alexandria, about the end of the 4th century, and Antonius, bishop of Laodicea, began to insult the national gods, the pagan philosophers and learned theurgists adopted effective measures to preserve the repositories of their sacred learning. Theophilus, a bishop, who left behind him a reputation of a most rascally and mercenary villain, was accused by one named Antonius, a famous theurgist and eminent scholar of occult science of Alexandria, with bribing the slaves of the Cyprian to steal books which he sold to foreigners at great prices. History tells us how Theophilus had the best of the philosophers in AD 389, and how his successor and nephew, the no less infamous Cyril, butchered Hypatia. Suidas gave us some details about Antonius, whom he calls Antonius, Antonius, who he calls Antonius, and his eloquent friend Olympius, the defender of the Cyprian. But history is far from being complete in the miserable remnants of books, which, crossing so many ages, have reached our own learned century. It fails to give the facts relating to the first 5 centuries of Christianity, which are preserved in the numerous traditions current in the East. Unauthenticated as these may appear, there is unquestionably in the heap of chaff much good grain. That these traditions are not oftener communicated to Europeans is not strange when we consider how apt our travelers are to render themselves antagonistic to the natives by their skeptical bearing and occasionally dogmatic intolerance. When exceptional men, like some archaeologists, who knew how to win the confidence and even friendship of certain Arabs, are favored with precious documents, it is simply declared a coincidence. And yet, there are widespread traditions of the existence of certain subterranean and immense galleries in the neighborhood of Ismonia, the petrified city, in which are stored numberless manuscripts and rolls. For no amount of money would the Arabs go near it. At night, they say, from the crevices of the desolate ruins sunk deep in the unwatered sands of the desert, stream the rays from lights carried to and fro from the galleries by no human hands. The Afrits study the literature of the antediluvian ages, according to their belief, and the Jinn learns from the magic rolls the lessons of the following day. The Encyclopedia Britannica, in its article on Alexandria, says, "When the temple of Serapis was demolished, the valuable library was pillaged or destroyed, and 20 years afterwards the empty shelves excited the regret," etc. But it does not state the subsequent fate of the pillaged books. In rivalry of the fierce Mary worshippers of the 4th century, the modern clerical persecutors of liberalism and heresy would willingly shut up all the heretics and their books in some modern Serapeum and burn them alive. The cause of this hatred is natural. Modern research has more than ever unveiled the secret. "It is not the worship of saints and angels now," said Bishop Newton years ago, "in all respects the same that the worship of demons was in former times. The name only is different. The thing is identically the same. The very same temples, the very same images, which were once consecrated to Jupiter and other demons, are now consecrated to the Virgin Mary and other saints. The whole of paganism is converted and applied to popery." Why not be impartial and add that a good portion of it was adopted by Protestant religions also? The very apostolic designation Peter is from the Mysteries. The Hierophant, or Supreme Pontiff, bore the Chaldean title Peter, or Interpreter. The names Ptah, Pethir, the residents of Balaam, Patara, and Patras, the names of the oracle cities Patres, or Pateras, and perhaps Buddha, all come from the same root. Jesus says, "Upon this Petra I will build my church, and the gates or rulers of Hades shall not prevail against it," meaning by Petra the rock temple, and by metaphor the Christian mysteries, the adversaries to which were the old mystery gods of the underworld, who were worshipped in the rites of Isis, Adonis, Attis, Sabazius, Dionysus, and the Eleusinian. No apostle Peter was ever at Rome, but the Pope, seizing the scepter of the Pontifex Maximus, the keys of Janus and Cubel, and adorning the Christian head with the cap of the Magna Mater, copied from that of the tiara of Brahmata, the supreme pontiff of the initiates of old India, became the successor of the pagan high priest, the real Petroma, or Petroma. The Roman Catholic Church has two far mightier enemies than the heretics and the infidels, and these are comparative mythology and philology. When such eminent divines as the Reverend James Freeman Clarke go so much out of their way to prove to the readers that critical theology from the time of Origen and Jerome, and the controversial theology during the 15 centuries, has not consisted in accepting on authority the opinions of other people, but was shown, on the contrary, much acute and comprehensive reasoning, We can but regret that so much scholarship should have been wasted in attempting to prove that which a fair survey of the history of theology upsets at every step. In these controversies and critical treatment of the doctrines of the Church, one can certainly find any amount of acute reasoning, but far more of a still acuter sophistry. Recently, the mass of cumulative ideas have been reinforced to an extent which leaves little, if any, room for a further controversy. A conclusive opinion is furnished by too many scholars to doubt the fact that India was the alma mater, not only of the civilizations, arts, and sciences, but also of all the great religions of antiquity, Judaism, and hence Christianity included. Herder places the cradle of humanity in India and shows Moses as a clever and relatively modern compiler of the ancient Brahmanical traditions. We discuss in the Bible study that almost certainly Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, those were amalgamations of various myths. We did not know where the source of those myths were, and so I don't have a problem with it possibly being India. I don't have the background to understand that. Now, the Sumerian flood myth is almost certainly where Moses got the idea that Noah and his sons, right? The only name that was really changed was Noah from Utapishtim, and the rest of the names are pretty much the same, and the story is pretty much the same. So it is entirely possible that that originated in India as well. The river which encircles the country, India, is the sacred Ganges, which all Asia considers to be the paradisical river. There, also, is the biblical Gihon, which is none else but the Indus. The Arabs call it so until this day, and the names of the countries watered by it are yet existing among the Hindus. Jacoliot claims to have translated every ancient palm leaf manuscript which he had the fortune of being allowed by the Brahmins of the pagodas to see. In one of his translations, we found passages which revealed to us the undoubted origin of the key of St. Peter, and account for the subsequent adoption of the symbol by their holiness, the popes of Rome. He shows us, on the testimony of the Agraucha Parikshai, which he freely translates as the Book of Spirits, Petrus, that centuries before our era, the initiates of the temples chose a superior council presided over by the Brahmatma, or supreme chief of all these initiates, that this pontificate, which could be exercised only by a Brahmin who had reached the age of 80 years, that the Brahmata was sole guardian of the mystic formula, resume of every science, contained in the three mysterious letters U-A-M, which signify creation, conservation, and transformation. He alone could expound its meaning in the presence of the initiates of the third and supreme degree. Whomsoever among these initiates revealed to a profane a single one of the truths, even the smallest of the secrets entrusted to his care, was put to death. He who received the confidence had to share his fate. Finally, to crown this able system, says Jacoliot, there existed a word still more superior to the mysterious monosyllable Om, in which rendered him who came into the possession of his key nearly the equal of Brahman himself. The Brahmata alone possessed this key and transmitted it in a sealed casket to a successor. Now, we talked yesterday about how it is really, really hard to know when you're going to die. If you have the key, right, the word sealed in a casket to be passed on to your successor, that eliminates that difficulty. But that does open it up to being stolen. So this unknown word, of which no human power could, even today, when the Brahmanical authority has been crushed under the Mongolian and European invasions, today, when each pagoda has its Brahmata, forced the disclosure, was engraved in a golden triangle and preserved in a sanctuary of the temple of Esgotha, whose Brahmata alone held the keys. He also bore upon his tiara 2 crossed keys, supported by 2 kneeling Brahmins, symbol of the precious deposit of which he had the keeping. This word and this triangle were engraved upon the tablet of the ring that this religious chief wore as one of the signs of his dignity. It was also framed in a golden sun on the altar, where every morning the Supreme Pontiff offered the sacrifice of the Sarvameda, a sacrifice to all the forces of nature. Is this clear enough? And will the Catholics still maintain that it was the Brahmins of 4,000 years ago who copied the ritual symbols and dress of the Roman pontiffs? We would not feel in the least surprised. Without going very far back into antiquity for comparisons, if we only stop at the 4th and 5th centuries of our era and contrast the so-called heathenism of the 3rd Neoplatonic eclectic school with the growing Christianity, the result may not be favorable to the latter. Even at that early period, when the new religion had hardly outlined its contradictory dogmas, when the champions of the bloodthirsty Cyril knew not themselves whether Mary was to become the mother of God, or rank as a demon in company with Isis, when the memory of the meek and lowly Jesus still lingered lovingly in every Christian's heart, and his words of mercy and charity vibrated still in the air, even then the Christians were outdoing the pagans in every kind of ferocity and religious intolerance. But if we look still farther back and see for examples the true Christism, in ages when Buddhism had hardly superseded Brahmanism in India, and the name of Jesus was only to be pronounced 3 centuries later, what do we find? Which of the holy pillars of the Church has ever elevated himself to the level of religious tolerance and noble simplicity of character of some heathen? Compare, for instance, the Hindu Asoka, who lived 300 BC, and the Carthaginian St. Augustine, who flourished 3 centuries after Christ. According to Max Muller, this is what is found engraved on the rocks of Girnar, Dauli, and Kapurdigiri. Piyadasi, the king beloved of the gods, desires that the ascetics of all creeds might reside in all places. All these ascetics profess alike the command which people should exercise over themselves and the purity of the soul. But people have different opinions and different inclinations. And here's what Augustine wrote after his baptism. Wondrous depths of thy words, whose surface, behold, is before us, inviting to little ones. Yet are they a wondrous depth, O my God, a wondrous depth. It is awful to look therein, yes, an awfulness of honor and a trembling of love. Thy enemies, read pagans, thereof I hate vehemently. Oh, that thou wouldst slay them with thy 2-edged sword, and they might no longer be enemies to it, for so do I love to have them slain. Wonderful spirit of Christianity, and that from a Manichaean, converted to the religion of one who even on his cross prayed for his enemies. Who the enemies of the Lord were, according to the Christians, is not difficult to surmise. A few inside the Augustinian fold were his new children and favorites, who had supplanted in his affections the sons of Israel. His chosen people, the rest of mankind, were his natural foes. The teeming multitudes of heathendom were proper food for the flames of hell. The handful within the church communion, heirs of salvation. But if such a prescriptive policy was just, and its enforcement was sweet savor in the nostrils of the Lord, why not scorn also the pagan rites and philosophy? Why draw so deep from the wells of wisdom, dug and filled up to the brim by the same heathen? Or did the fathers, in their desire to imitate the chosen people, whose time-worn shoes they were trying to fit upon their feet, contemplate the reenaction of the spoliation scene of the Exodus? Did they propose, in fleeing from heathendom, as the Jews did from Egypt, to carry off the valuables of its religious allegories, as the chosen ones did the gold and silver ornaments? It It certainly does seem as if the events of the first centuries of Christianity were but the reflection of the images thrown upon the mirror of the future at the time of the Exodus. During the stormy days of Irenaeus of the Platonic philosophy, with its mystical submersion into deity, was not so obnoxious after all to the new doctrine as to prevent the Christians from helping themselves to its abstruse metaphysics in every way and manner. Allying themselves with the ascetical therapeutae, forefathers and models of the Christian monks and hermits, it was in Alexandria, let it be remembered, that they laid the first foundations of the purely Platonic Trinitarian doctrine. It became the Plato-Phalonian doctrine later. As such, we find it now. Plato considered the divine nature under a threefold modification of the first cause, the reason, or logos, and the soul, or spirit, of the universe. The three archaical, or original principles, says Gibbon, were represented in the Platonic system as three gods, united with each other by a mysterious and ineffable generation. Blending this transcendental idea with the more hypostatic figure of the Logos of Philo, whose doctrine was that the oldest Kabbalah, and who viewed the King Messiah as the Metatron, or the angel of the Lord, the Legatus descended in flesh, but not the Ancient of Days himself. The Christians clothed this mythical representation of the mediator for the fallen race of Adam, Jesus, the Son of Mary. Under this unexpected garb, his personality was all but lost. In the modern Jesus of the Christian Church, we find the ideal of the imaginative Irenaeus, not the adept of the Essenes, the obscure reformer from Galilee. We see him under the disfigured Plato-Phalonian mask, not as the disciples heard him on the Mount. So far, then, the heathen philosophy had helped them in the building of the principal dogma, but when the theurgists from the third Neoplatonic school, deprived of their ancient mysteries, strove to blend the doctrines of Plato with those of Aristotle, and by combining the two philosophies, added to their theosophy and the primeval doctrines of the Oriental Kabbalah, then the Christians, from rivals, became persecutors. Once that the metaphysical allegories of Plato were being prepared to be discussed in public in the form of Grecian dialectics, all the elaborate system of the Christian Trinity would be unraveled, and the divine prestige completely upset. The eclectic school, reversing the order, had adopted the inductive method, and this method became its death knell. Of all things on earth, logic and reasonable explanations were the most hateful to the new religion of mystery, for they threatened to unveil the whole groundwork of the Trinitarian conception, to apprise the multitude of the doctrine of emanations, and thus destroy the unity of the whole. It could not be permitted, and it was not. History records the Christ-like means that were resorted to. The universal doctrine of emanations, adopted from time immemorial by the greatest schools which taught the Kabbalistic, Alexandrian, and Oriental philosophers, gives the key to that panic among the Christian fathers. That spirit of Jesuitism and clerical craft which prompted Parkhurst, many centuries later, to suppress in his Hebrew lexicon the true meaning of the first words of Genesis, originated in those days of war against the expiring Neoplatonic and eclectic school. The fathers had decided to pervert the meaning of the word demon, and they treaded, above all, to have the esoteric and true meaning of the word razit unveiled to the multitudes. For if once the true sense of this sentence, as well as that of the Hebrew word azt, translated in the Septuagint angels, while it means emanations, were understood rightly, the mystery of the Christian Trinity would have crumbled, carrying, in its downfall, the new religion into the same heap of ruins with the ancient mysteries. This is the true reason why dialecticians, as well as Aristotle himself, the prying philosopher, were ever obnoxious to Christian theology. Even Luther, while on his work of reform, feeling the ground insecure under his feet, notwithstanding that the dogmas had been reduced by him to their simplest expression, gave full vent to his fear and hatred for Aristotle. The amount of abuse he heaped upon the memory of the great logician can only be equaled, never surpassed, by the Pope's anathemas and invectives against the liberals of the Italian government. Compiled together, they might easily fill a copy of a new encyclopedia with models for monkish diatribes. Of course, the Christian clergy can never get reconciled with a doctrine based on the application of strict logic to discursive reasoning. The number of those who have abandoned theology on this account have never been made known. They have often asked questions and been forbidden to ask them. We talked about that yesterday, right? How most of the people who leave the theological seminaries don't do so because of academics, but because they have a crisis of faith for very, very valid reasons. Hence, separation, disgust, and often a despairing plunge into the abyss of atheism. The Orphean views of ether as chief medium between God and created matter were likewise denounced. The Orphic ether recalled too vividly the archaeus, the soul of the world, and the latter was in its metaphysical sense as closely related to the emanations, being the first manifestation, Sephira, or divine light. And when could the latter be more feared than at that critical moment? Origen, Clemens Alexandrinus, Chalcidius, Methodius, and Maimonides, on the authority of the Targum of Jerusalem, the orthodox and greatest authority of the Jews, held that the first two words in the book of Genesis, Bereshit, mean wisdom, or the principle, and that the idea of those words meaning in the beginning was never shared but by the profane, who were not allowed to penetrate any deeper into the esoteric sense of the sentence. Beausoleil, and after him Godfrey Higgins, have demonstrated the fact. All things, says the Kabbalah, are derived from one great principle, and this principle is the unknown and invisible God. From him, a substantial power immediately proceeds, which is the image of God, and the source of all subsequent emanations. This second principle sends forth by the energy, or will to force, of emanation, of the natures which are more or less perfect, according to their different degrees of distance in the scale of emanation, from the first source of existence, which constitute different worlds, or orders of being, all united to the eternal power from which they proceed. Matter is nothing more than the most remote effect of the emanative energy of the deity. The material world receives its form from the immediate agency of powers far beneath the first source of being. Beausoleil makes St. Augustine the Manichaean say thus: and if, by receipt, we understand the active principle of the creation instead of its beginning, in such case we will clearly perceive that Moses never meant to say that heaven and earth were the first works of God. He only said that God created heaven and earth through the principle, who is his Son. It is not the time he points to, but to the immediate author of the creation. Angels, according to Augustine, were created before the firmament, and according to the esoteric interpretation, the heavens and earth were created after that, evolving from the second principle, or the Logos, the creative deity. The word principle, says Beausoleil, does not mean that the heavens and earth were created before anything else, for, to begin with, the angels were created before that, but that God did everything through his wisdom, which is his verbum, and which the Christian Bible named the beginning. Thus, adopting the exoteric meaning of the word, abandoned to the multitudes. The Kabbalah, the Oriental as well as the Jewish, shows that a number of emanations, the Jewish Sephiroth, issued from the first principle, the chief of which was wisdom. This wisdom is the Logos of Philo and Michael, the chief of the Gnostic eons. It is the Ormuzd of the Persians, Minerva, goddess of wisdom of the Greeks, who emanated from the head of Jupiter, and the second person of the Christian Trinity. The early fathers of the church had not much to exert their imagination. They found a ready-made doctrine that had existed in every theogony for thousands of years before the Christian era. Their Trinity is but the trio of Sephiroth, the first three Kabbalistic lights of which Moses Nachmanides says that they have never been seen by anyone. There is not any defect in them, nor any disunion. The first eternal number is the Father, or the Chaldean primeval, invisible and incomprehensible chaos, out of which proceeds the intelligible one. The Egyptian Ptah, or the principle of light, not the light itself, and the principle of life, though himself no life. The wisdom by which the Father created the heavens is the Son, and the Kabbalistic androgynous Adam Kadmon. The Son is at once the male Ra, or light of wisdom, prudence, or intelligence, Sephira, the female part of himself, while from this dual being proceeds the third emanation, the Binah, or reason, the second intelligence, the Holy Ghost of the Christians. Therefore, strictly speaking, there is a tetractys, or quaternary, consisting of the unintelligible first monad in its triple emanation, which properly constitute our Trinity. How then to avoid perceiving at once that had not the Christians purposely disfigured in their interpretation and translation the Mosaic Genesis to fit their own views, their religion with its present dogmas would have been impossible. The word Rasid, once taught in its new sense of the principle and not the beginning, and the anathemized doctrine of the emanations accepted, the position of the second Trinitarian personage becomes untenable. For if the angels are the first divine emanations from the divine substance, and were in existence before the second principle, then the anthropomorphized Son is at best an emanation like themselves, and cannot be God hypostatically any more than our visible works are ourselves. That these metaphysical subtleties never entered into the head of the honest-minded, sincere Paul is evident. And again, Paul is no one to listen to. As is furthermore evident that all like to learn Jews, he was well acquainted with the doctrine of emanations and never thought of corrupting it. How can anyone imagine that Paul identified the Son with the Father when he tells us that God made Jesus a little lower than the angels, Hebrews 2:9, and a little higher than Moses? For this man was counted worthy of more glory than Moses, Hebrews 3:3. Of whatever or how many forgeries interlined later in the Acts the fathers are guilty, we know not, but that Paul never considered Christ more than a man, full of the Spirit of God, is but too evident. In the Arche, it was the Logos, and the Logos was adnate to the Theos. Wisdom, the first emanation of Ein Sof, the Protagonos, the Hypostasis, the Adam Kadmon of the Kabbalists, the Brahma of the Hindu, the Logos of Plato, and the beginning of St. John, is the Rasit of the book of Genesis. And again, you can fall back to my interpretation of Genesis, where we talk about how the Logos and the beginning, the Word, and He created, was actually the same thing. If rightly interpreted, it overturns, as we have remarked, the whole elaborate system of Christian theology, for it proves that behind the creative deity there was a higher God, a planner, an architect, and that the former was but his executive agent, a simple power. They persecuted the Gnostics, murdered the philosophers, and burned the Kabbalists and their Masons. And when the day of the great reckoning arrives, and the light shines in darkness, what will they have to offer in the place of the departed, expired religion? What will they answer, the pretended monotheists, these worshippers and pseudo-servants of the one living God, to their Creator? How will they account for this long persecution of them who were the true followers of the Grand Megalistor, the supreme Grand Master of the Rosicrucians, the first of the Masons? For he is the builder and architect of the temple of the universe. He is the verbum sapiente. Everyone knows, wrote the great Manichaean of the 3rd century, Faust, that the Evangeliums were written neither by Jesus Christ nor his apostles, but long after their time by some unknown persons, who, judging well that they would hardly be believed when telling of things they had not seen themselves, headed their narratives with the names of the apostles or of disciples contemporaneous with the latter. And again, if you refer to the Unconventional Bible Study, you will see that we discussed this very thing. Commenting upon the subject, A. Franck, the learned Hebrew scholar of the Institute and translator of the Kabbalah, expresses the same idea. Are we not authorized, he asked, to view the Kabbalah as a precious remnant of a religious philosophy of the Orient, which, transported into Alexandria, got mixed to the doctrine of Plato, and under the usurped name of Dionysius, the Areopagite, bishop of Athens, converted and consecrated by St. Paul, was thus enabled to penetrate into the mysticisms of the medieval ages? Says de Colliot, What is then this religious philosophy of the Orient which has penetrated into the mystic symbolism of Christianity? We answer, this philosophy, the traces of which we find among the Magians, the Chaldeans, the Egyptians, the Hebrew Kabbalists, and the Christians, is none other than that of the Hindu Brahmins, the sectarians of the Pitris, or the spirits of the invisible world which surround us. But if the Gnostics were destroyed, the Gnosis, based on the secret science of sciences, still lives. It is the earth which helps the woman, and which is destined to open her mouth to swallow up medieval Christianity, the usurper and assassin of the great master's doctrine. The ancient Kabbalah, the Gnosis, or traditional secret knowledge, was never without its representatives in any age or country. The trinities of initiates, whether passed into history or concealed under the impenetrable veil of mystery, are preserved and impressed throughout the ages. They are known to Moses, Aholiab, and Bazaleel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, as Plato, Philo, and Pythagoras, etc. At the Transfiguration, we see them as Jesus, Moses, and Elias, the 3 Trismegisti, the 3 Kabbalists, Peter, James, and John, whose revelation is the key to all wisdom. We found them in the twilight of the Jewish history as Zoroaster, Abraham, and Terah, and later as Enoch, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Who, of those who ever study the ancient philosophies, who understand intuitionally the grandeur of their conceptions, the boundless sublimity of their views of unknown deity, can hesitate for a moment to give the preference to their doctrines over the incomprehensible, dogmatic, and contradictory theology of the hundreds of Christian sects? Who that ever read Plato and fathomed his Tuov, whom no person has seen except the Son, can doubt that Jesus was a disciple of the same secret doctrine which had instructed the great philosopher? For, as we have shown before now, Plato never claimed to be the inventor of all that he wrote, but gave credit for it to Pythagoras, who, in his turn, pointed to the remote East as the source whence he derived his information and his philosophy. Colebrooke shows that Plato confesses it in his epistles and says that he has taken his teachings from ancient and sacred doctrines. Moreover, it is undeniable that the theologies of all the great nations dovetail together and show that each is a part of one stupendous whole. Like the rest of the initiates, we see Plato taking great pains to conceal the true meaning of his allegories. Every time the subject touches the greater secrets of the Oriental Kabbalah, secret of the true cosmogony of the universe and of the ideal pre-existing world, Plato shrouds his philosophy in the profundest darkness. His Timaeus is so confused that no one but an initiate can understand the secret meaning. I disagree with that completely. You should check out Timaeus, which is part of the Ancient Lore playlist, where we discuss that in some detail. And Mosham thinks that Philo has filled his works with passages directly contradicting each other for the sole purpose of concealing the true doctrine. For once, we see a critic on the right track. And this very Trinitarian idea, as well as the so bitterly denounced doctrine of emanations, whence their remotest origin? The answer is easy, and every proof is now at hand. In the sublime and profundest of all the philosophies, that of the universal wisdom religion, the first traces of which historical research now finds in the old pre-Vedic religions of India. The much-abused Jacoliot well remarks, "It is not in the religious works of antiquity, such as the Vedas, the Zend-Avesta, and the Bible, that we have to search for the exact expression of the ennobling and sublime beliefs of those epochs. The holy primitive syllable, composed of the three letters AUM, and which contained the Vedic Trimurti, Trinity, must be kept secret, like another triple Veda," says Manu in Book 11, Sloka 265. Swayambhuva is the unrevealed deity. It is the being existent through and of itself. He is the central and immortal germ of all that exists in the universe. Three trinities emanate and are confounded in him, forming a supreme unity. These trinities, or the triple Trimurti, are Nara, Nari, and Viradi, the initial triad, the Agni, Vaya, and Surya, the manifested triad, Brahma, Vishnu, and Siva, the creative triad. Each of these triads becomes less metaphysical and more adapted to the vulgar intelligence as it descends. Thus, the last becomes but the symbol of its concrete expression, the necessarianism of a purely metaphysical conception. Together with the Swayambhuva, they are the 10 Sephiroth of the Hebrew Kabbalists, the 10 Hindu Prajapatis, the Ein Sof of the former, answering to the great unknown, expressed by the mystic Om of the latter. Says Franck, the translator of the Kabbalah, the 10 Sephiroth are divided into 3 classes, each of them presenting to us the divinity under a different aspect, the whole still remaining an indivisible trinity. The first 3 Sephiroth are purely intellectual in metaphysics. They express the absolute identity of existence and thought, and form what the modern Kabbalists called the intelligible world, which is the first manifestation of God. The 3 that follow make us conceive God in one of their aspects, as the identity of goodness and wisdom. In the other, they show us in the supreme good the origin of beauty and magnificence in the creation. Therefore, they are named the virtues, or the sensible world. And finally, we learn, by the last 3 Sephiroth, that the universal providence, that the supreme artist is also absolute force, and the all-powerful cause, and that, at the same time, this cause is the generative element of all that is. It is these last Sephiroth that constitute the natural world, or nature in its essence, and in its active principle, natura naturans. This Kabbalistic conception is thus proved identical with that of the Hindu philosophy. Whoever reads Plato in his dialogue, Timaeus, again I have that, will find these ideas as faithfully re-echoed by the Greek philosopher. Moreover, the injunction of secrecy was as strict with the Kabbalists as with the initiates of the Advaita and the Hindu yogis. Close thy mouth, lest thou shouldst speak of this, the mystery, and thy heart, lest thou shouldst think aloud. And if thy heart has escaped thee, bring it back to its place, for such is the object of our alliance. Sefer Jezerah, Book of Creation. This is a secret which gives death. Close thy mouth, lest thou should reveal to the vulgar. Compress thy brain, lest something should escape from it and fall outside. Agrauchata Parishikai. Truly, the fate of many a future generation hung on a gossamer thread in the days of the 3rd and 4th centuries. Had not the emperor sent in 389 to Alexandria a rescript, which was forced from him by the Christians, for the destruction of every idol, our own century would never have had a Christian mythological pantheon of its own. Never did the Neoplatonic school reach such a height of philosophy as when nearest its end, uniting the mystic theosophy of old Egypt with the refined philosophy of the Greeks, nearer to the ancient mysteries of Thebes and Memphis than they had been for centuries. Versed in the science of soothsaying and divination, as in the art of the therapeutist, friendly with the acutest men of the Jewish nation, who were deeply imbued with the Zoroastrian ideas. The Neoplatonists tend to amalgamate the old wisdom of the Oriental Kabbalah with the more refined conceptions of the Occidental Theosophist. Notwithstanding the treason of the Christians, who saw fit, for political reasons, after the days of Constantine, to repudiate their tutors, the influence of the new Platonic philosophy is conspicuous in the subsequent adoption of dogmas, the origin of which can be traced but too easily to that remarkable school. Though mutilated and disfigured, they still preserve a strong family likeness which nothing can obliterate. But if the knowledge of the occult powers of nature opens the spiritual sight of man, enlarges his intellectual faculties, and leads him unerringly to a profounder veneration for the Creator, on the other hand, ignorance, dogmatic narrow-mindedness, and a childish fear of looking at the bottom of things invariably leads to fetish worship and superstition. When Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria, had openly embraced the cause of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, and had anthropomorphized her into Mary, the Mother of God, and the Trinitarian controversy had taken place, from that moment, the Egyptian doctrine of the emanation of the creative God out of Mepht began to be tortured in 1,000 ways until the council had agreed upon the adoption of it as it now stands, the disfigured ternary of the Kabbalistic Solomon and Philo. But, as its origin was yet too evident, the Word was no longer called the heavenly man, the primal Adam Kamon, but became the Logos, Christ, and was made as old as the Ancient of Ancients, his Father. The concealed wisdom became identical with its emanation, the divine thought, and made to be regarded co-equal and co-eternal with its first manifestation. If we now stop to consider another of the fundamental dogmas of Christianity, the doctrine of atonement, we may trace it as easily back to heathendom. This cornerstone of a church which had believed herself built on a firm rock for long centuries is now excavated by science and proved to come from the Gnostics. Professor Draper shows it as hardly known in the days of Tertullian as having originated among the Gnostic heretics. We will not permit ourselves to contradict such a learned authority further than to state that it originated among them no more than their anointed Christos and Sophia. The former they modeled on the original of the King Messiah, the male principle of wisdom, and the latter on the third Sephiroth from the Chaldean Kabbalah, and even from the Hindu Brahma and Sarasvati, and the pagan Dionysus and Demeter. And here we are on firm ground, if it were only because it is now proved that the New Testament never appeared in complete form, such as we find it now, till 300 years after the period of apostles, and the Zohar and other Kabbalistic books are to be found to belong to the 1st century before our era, if not to be far older still. The Gnostics entertained many of the Essenian ideas, and the Essenes had their greater and minor mysteries at least 2 centuries before our era. They were the Isarim, or initiates, the descendants of the Egyptian hierophants, in whose country they had been settled for several centuries before they were converted to Buddhistic monasticism by the missionaries of King Asoka, and amalgamated later with the earliest Christians. And they existed, probably, before the old Egyptian temples were desecrated and ruined in the incessant invasions of the Persians, Greeks, and other conquering hordes. The Hierophants had their atonement enacted in the mystery of initiation ages before the Gnostics, or even the Essenes, had appeared. It was known among Hierophants as the baptism of blood, and was considered not as an atonement for the fall of man in Eden, but simply as an expiation for the past, present, and future sins of ignorant, but nevertheless polluted mankind. The Hierophant had the option of either offering his pure and sinless life as a sacrifice for his race to the gods whom he hoped to rejoin, or an animal victim. The former depended entirely on their own will. At the last moment of the solemn new birth, the initiator passed the word to the initiated, and immediately after this, the latter had a weapon placed in his right hand and was ordered to strike. This is the true origin of the Christian dogma of atonement. Verily, the Christs of the pre-Christian ages were many, but they died unknown to the world and disappeared as silently and as mysteriously from the sight of man as Moses from the top of Pisgah, the mountain of Nebo, oracular wisdom, after he had laid his hands upon Joshua, and who thus became full of the spirit of wisdom, an example, initiated. Nor does the mystery of the Eucharist pertain to Christians alone. Godfrey Higgins proves that it was instituted many hundreds of years before the Paschal Supper, and says that the sacrifice of bread and wine was common to many ancient nations. Cicero mentions it in his works and wonders at the strangeness of the rite. There had been an esoteric meaning attached to it from the first establishment of the mysteries, and the Eucharista is one of the oldest rites of antiquity. With the Hierophants, it had nearly the same significance as with the Christians. Ceres was bread and Bacchus was wine. The former meaning regeneration of life from the seed, and the latter the grape, the emblem of wisdom and knowledge, the accumulation of the spirit of things, and the fermentation and subsequent strength of that esoteric knowledge being justly symbolized by wine. The mystery related to the drama of Eden, it is said to have been first taught by Janus, who was also the first to introduce in the temples the sacrifice of bread and wine, in commemoration of the fall into generation as the symbol of the seed. I am the vine, and my Father is the husbandman, says Jesus, alluding to the secret knowledge that could be imparted by him. I will drink no more of the fruit of the vine until that day that I drink it new in the kingdom of God. The festival of the Eleusinian Mysteries began in the month of Boedromion, which corresponds with the month of September, the time of great gathering, and lasted from the 15th to the 22nd of the month, 7 days. The Hebrew festival of the Feast of Tabernacles began on the 15th and ended on the 22nd of the month of Ethanim, which Dunlap shows is derived from Adonam, Adonia, Atenum, Ethanium, and this feast is named in Exodus 23:16, the Feast of Ingatherings. All the men of Israel assembled unto Solomon, King Solomon, at the feast in the month of Ethanim, which is the 7th. Plutarch thinks the Feast of Booths to be the Bacchic rites, not the Eleusinian. Thus, Bacchus was directly called upon, he says. The Sabbazian worship was Sabbatic. The names Evius or Hevius and Luius are identical with Hivite and Levite. The French name Louis is the Hebrew Levi. Iacchus again is Io or Jehovah, and Baal or Adon, like Bacchus, was a phallic god. Who shall ascend into the hill, the high place, of the Lord, as the holy King David? Who shall stand in the place of this Kadeshu? Psalms 24:3. Kadesh may mean in one sense to devote, hallow, sanctify, and even to initiate or set apart, but also means the ministers of lascivious rites, the Venus worship, and the true interpretation of the word Kadesh is bluntly rendered in Deuteronomy 23:17, Hosea 4:14, and Genesis 38 from verses 15 to 22. The holy Kadeshuth of the Bible were identical as to the duties of their office with the Nawach girls of the later Hindu pagodas. The Hebrew Kadeshim or Gali lived by the house of the Lord, where the woman wove hangings for the grove, or the bust of Venus Astarte, says a verse, the 7th and the 23rd chapter of 2 Kings. The dance performed by David around the ark was the circle dance, and said to have been prescribed by the Amazons for the mysteries. Such was the dance of the daughters of Shiloh, Judges 21:23, at Pasim, and the leaping of the prophets of Baal, 1 Kings 28:26, or 18:26. It was simply a characteristic of the Sabaean worship, for it denoted the motions of the planets around the sun. That the dance was a Bacchic frenzy is apparent. Sistra were used on the occasion, and the taunt of Michael and his king's reply are very expressive. The king of Israel uncovered himself before his maidservants as one of the vain, or debauched, fellows shamelessly uncovereth himself. And he retorts, I will play, act wantonly, before, and I will be yet more vile than this, and I will be base in my own sight. When we remember that David has sojourned among the Tyrians and Philistines, where their rites were common, and that indeed he had conquered that land away from the house of Saul, by the aid of mercenaries from their country, the countenancing and even perhaps the introduction of such a pagan-like worship by the weak psalmist seems very natural. David knew nothing of Moses, it seems. If he introduced the Jehovah worship, it was not in its monotheistic character, but simply as that of one of the many gods of the neighboring nations, a tutelar deity to whom he had given the preference and chosen among all other gods. Following the Christian dogmas, seriatim, if we concentrate our attention upon one which provoked the fiercest battles until its recognition, that of the Trinity, what do we find? We meet it, as we have shown, northeast of the Indus, and tracing it to Asia Minor and Europe, recognize it among every people who had anything like an established religion. It was taught in the oldest Chaldean, Egyptian, and Mithriatic schools. The Chaldean sun god, Mithra, was called triple, and the Trinitarian idea of the Chaldeans was a doctrine of the Akkadians, who, themselves, belonged to a race which was the first to conceive a metaphysical trinity. The Chaldeans are a tribe of the Akkadians, according to Rawlinson, who lived in Babylonia from the earliest times. They were Turanians, according to others, and instructed the Babylonians into the first notions of religion. But these same Akkadians, who were they? Those scientists who would ascribe to them a Turanian origin make of them the inventors of the cuneiform characters. Others call them Sumerians, others again, respectively, make their language, of which, for very good reasons, no traces would ever remain, Chaldean, Celtic, Proto-Chaldean, Caddo-Scythic, and so on. The only tradition worthy of credence is that these Akkadians instructed the Babylonians in the mysteries and taught them the sacerdotal, or mystery, language. These Akkadians were then simply a tribe of the Hindu Brahmins, now called Aryans, their vernacular language, the Sanskrit of the Vedas, and the sacred or mystery language, that which, even in our own age, is used by the Hindu fakirs and initiated Brahmins in their magical evocations. It has been, from time immemorial, and still is, employed by the initiates of all countries, and the Tibetan lamas claim that it is in this tongue that appear the mysterious characters on the leaves and bark of the sacred kombam. Jacoliad, who took such pains to penetrate the mysteries of the Brahmanical initiation in translating and commenting upon the Agrachata Parikashai, confesses the following. It is pretended also, without our being able to verify the assertion, that the magical evocations were pronounced in a particular language, and that it was forbidden, under pain of death, to translate them into vulgar dialects. The rare expressions that we have been able to catch, like lurum, hum, shurum, shorim, are in fact most curious, and do not seem to belong to any known idiom. Those who have seen a fakir or lama reciting his mantras and conjurations know that he never pronounces the words audibly when preparing for a phenomenon. His lips move, and none will ever hear the terrible formula pronounced, except in the interior of the temples, and then in a cautious whisper. This, then, was the language now respectively baptized by every scientist, and, according to his imaginative and philological propensities, Castio-Semitic, Scythic, Proto-Chaldean, and the like. Scarcely two of even the most learned Sanskrit philologists are agreed as to the true interpretation of Vedic words. Let one put forth an essay, a lecture, a treatise, a translation, a dictionary, and straightway all the others fall to quarreling with each other and with him as to his sins of omission and commission. Professor Whitney, one of the great American Orientalists, says that Professor Muller's stories, notes on the Rig Veda Samhita, are far from showing that sound and thoughtful judgment and moderation and economy which are among the most precious qualities of an exegete. Professor Muller angrily retorts upon his critics that not only is the joy embittered, which is the inherent reward of all bona fide work, but selfishness, malignity, aye, even untruthfulness, gain the upper hand, and a healthy growth of science is stunted. He differs, in many cases, from the explanations of the Vedic words given by Professor Roth in his Sanskrit dictionary, and Professor Whitney shampoos both their heads by saying that they are unquestionably words and phrases as to which both alike will hereafter be set right. In Volume 1 of his Chips, Professor Muller stigmatizes all the Vedas except the Rig and Athara Veda, included as theological twaddle, while Professor Whitney regards the latter as the most comprehensive and valuable of the four collections, next after the Rig. According to the case of to return to the case of Jacoliot, Professor Whitney brands him as a bungler and a humbug, and, as we remarked above, this is the very general verdict. But when the Bibli dans Lienda appeared, the Société Académique de Saint-Quentin requested M. Textor de Ravisi, a learned Indianist, 10 years governor of Karakal, India, to report upon its merits. He was an ardent Catholic and bitterly opposed to Jacoliot's conclusions, where they discredited the Mosaic and Catholic revelations, but he was forced to say, written with good faith in an easy, vigorous, and passionate style, of an easy and varied argumentation, the works of M. Jacoliot is of absorbing interest, a learned work on known facts and with familiar arguments. Enough. Let Jacoliot have the benefit of the doubt when such very imposing authorities are doing their best to show each other up as incompetents and literary journeymen. We quite agree with Professor Whitney that the truism that, for European critics, it is far easier to pull pieces than to build up, is nowhere truer than in matters affecting the archaeology and history of India. Babylonia happened to be situated on the way of the great stream of the earliest Hindu immigration, and the Babylonians were one of the first peoples benefited thereby. These Chaldee were the worshippers of the moon god, Deus Lunas, from which fact we may infer that the Akkadians, if such must be their name, belonged to the race of the kings of the moon, whom tradition shows as having reigned in Puri, now Allahabad. With them, the trinity of Deus Lunas was manifested in the 3 lunar phases, completing the quaternary with the 4th, and typifying the death of the moon god in its gradual waning and final disappearance. This death was allegorized by them and attributed to the triumph of the genius of evil over the light-giving deity, as the latter nations allegorized the death of their sun gods, Osiris and Apollo, at the hands of Typhon and the great dragon Python. When the sun entered the winter solstice, Babel, Arak, and Akkad are names of the sun. The Zoroastrian oracles are full and explicit upon the subject of the divine triad. A triad of deities shines forth throughout the whole world, of which a monad is the head, admits the Reverend Dr. Maurice. Sorry. For from this triad in the bosoms are all things governed, says the Chaldean oracle. The Phos, pure, and Phlox of Senshotniathon are light, fire, and flame, three manifestations of the sun, who is one, Bel Saturn, Jupiter Bel, and Bel or Baal Chom are the Chaldean trinity. The Babylonian Bel was regarded in the triune aspect of Belitan, Zeus Belus, the mediator, and Baal Chom, who is Apollo Chomius. This was the triune aspect of the highest God, who is, according to Berosus, either El, the Hebrew, Bel, Belitan, Mithra, or Zarvana, and has the name, the Father, the Brahma, Vishnu, and Siva, corresponding to power, wisdom, and justice, which answer in their turn to spirit, matter, time, and the past, present, and future, can be found in the temple of Garipuri. Thousands of dogmatic Brahmins worship these attributes of the Vedic deity, while the severe monks and nuns of Buddhistic Tibet recognize but the sacred trinity of the three cardinal virtues: poverty, chastity, and obedience, professed by the Christians, practiced by the Buddhists, and some Hindus alone. The Persian triplicate deity also consists of three persons: Ormazd, Mithra, and Ahriman. That is that principle, says Porphyry, which the author of the Chaldaic Summary saith, they conceive there is one principle of all things, and declare that it is one and good. The Chinese idol, Sanpao, consists of three equal in all respects, and the Peruvians suppose their Tanga to be 1 in 3 and 3 in 1, says Faven. The Egyptians had their Impht, Ikton, and Ptah, and the triple god, seated on the lotus, can be seen in the St. Petersburg Museum on a medal of the northern Tartars. Among the church dogmas which have most seriously suffered of late at the hands of the Orientalist, the last in question stands conspicuous. The reputation of each of the three personages of the anthropomorphic Godhead as an original revelation to the Christians through divine will has been badly compromised by inquiry into its predecessors and origin. Orientalists have published more about the similarity between Brahmanism, Buddhism, and Christianity than was strictly agreeable to the Vatican. Draper's assertion that paganism was modified by Christianity, Christianity by paganism, is daily being verified. Olympus was restored by but the divinities passed under other names, he says, treating of the Constantine period. The more powerful provinces insisted on the adoption of their time-honored conceptions. Views of the Trinity in accordance with the Egyptian traditions were established. Not only was the adoration of Isis under a new name restored, but even her image, standing on the crescent moon, reappeared. The well-known effigy of that goddess with the infant Horus in her arms has descended to our days, and the beautiful artistic creations of the Madonna and her child. But a still earlier origin than the Egyptian and Chaldean can be assigned to the Virgin Mother of God, Queen of Heaven. Though Isis is also by right the Queen of Heaven, and is generally represented carrying in her hand the crux otsata, composed of the mundane cross, and of the stauros of the Gnostics, she is a great deal younger than the celestial virgin Neith. In one of the tombs of the pharaohs, Ramses, in the valley of Biban and Manluk in Thebes, Champollion Jr. discovered a picture, according to his opinion, the most ancient ever yet found. It represents the heavens, symbolized by the figure of a woman bedecked with stars. The birth of the sun is figured by the form of the little child issuing from the bosom of its divine mother. In the book of Hermes, Pomander, I have that also in the Ancient Lore playlist, is enunciated in distinct and unequivocal sentences the whole Trinitarian dogma accepted by the Christians. The light is me, says Pomander, the divine thought. I am the new sword intelligence, and I am thy God. And I am far older than the human principle which escapes from the shadow. I am the germ of thought, the resplendent word, the Son of God. Think what that thus think that what thus sees and hears in thee is the verbum of the Master. It is the thought, which is God the Father, the celestial ocean, the ether, which flows from east to west. It is the breath of the Father, the life-giving principle, the Holy Ghost. For they are not at all separated, and their union is life. Ancient as may be the origin of Hermes, lost in the unknown days of Egyptian colonization, there is yet a far older prophecy directly relating to the Hindu Krishna, according to the Brahmins. It is, to say the least, strange that the Christians claim to base their religion upon a prophecy of the Bible, which exists nowhere in that book. In what chapter and verse does Jehovah, the Lord God, promise Adam and Eve to send them a Redeemer who will save the humanity? That is not in the entirety of the Old Testament, nowhere at all. I will put enmity between thee and the woman, says the Lord God to the serpent, and between thy seed and her seed it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. In these words there is not the slightest allusion to a Redeemer, and the subtlest of intellects could not extract from them, as they stand in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, anything like that which the Christians have contrived to find. On the other hand, in the traditions and Manu, Brahma promises directly to the first couple to send them a Savior who will teach them the way to salvation. It is from the lips of a messenger of Brahma who will be born in Kurukshetra, Matsya, the land of Panchola, also called Kanya Kubja, Mountain of the Virgin, that all men on earth will learn their duty, says Manu, Book 2, Slokas 19 and 20. The Mexicans call the father of their trinity Yazona, the Son Bacab, and the Holy Ghost Ekva, and say they received it, the doctrine, from their ancestors. Among the Semitic nations, we can trace the Trinity to the prehistorical days of the fabled Sesostris, who is identified by more than one critic with Nimrod, the mighty hunter. Manetho makes the oracle rebuke the king when the latter asks, "Tell me, O thou strong in fire, who before me could subjugate all things, and who after me?" And the oracle saith thus, "First God, then the Word, and then the Spirit." In the foregoing lies the foundation of the fierce hatred towards the Christians, towards the pagans, and the theurgists. Too much had been borrowed. The ancient religions and the Neoplatonists had been laid by them under contribution sufficiently to perplex the world for several thousand years. Had not the ancient creeds been speedily obliterated, it would have been found impossible to preach the Christian religion as a new dispensation, or the direct revelation from God the Father, through God the Son, and under the influence of God the Holy Ghost. As a political exigence, the fathers had, to gratify the wishes of their rich converts, instituted even the festivals of Pan. They went so far as to accept the ceremonies hitherto celebrated by the pagan world in honor of the god of the gardens, in all their primitive sincerity. It was time to sever the connection. Either the pagan worship and the Neoplatonic theurgy, with all ceremonial of magic, must be crushed out forever, or the Christians become Neoplatonists. The fierce polemics and single-minded battles between Irenaeus and the Gnostics are too well known to need repetition. They were carried on for over 2 centuries, after the unscrupulous Bishop of Lyons had uttered his last religious paradox. Celsus, the Neoplatonist, and a disciple of the school of Ammonius Saccas, had thrown the Christians into perturbation, and had arrested for a time the progress of proselytism by successfully proving that the original and purer forms of the most important dogmas of Christianity were to be found only in the teachings of Plato. Celsus accused them of accepting the worst superstitions of paganism and of interpolating passages from the books of the Sibyls, without rightly understanding their meaning. The accusations were so plausible, and the facts so patent, that for a long time no Christian writer had ventured to answer the challenge. Origen, at the fervent request of his friend Ambrosius, was the first to take the defense in hand, for having belonged to the same Platonic school of Ammonius, he was considered the most competent man to refute the well-founded charges. But his eloquence failed, and the only remedy that could be found was to destroy the writings of Celsus themselves. This could be achieved only in the 5th century, when copies had been taken from this work, and many were those who had read and studied them. If no copy of it had descended to our present generation of scientists, it is not because there is none extant at present, but for the simple reason that the monks of certain Oriental church on Mount Athos will neither show nor confess they have one in their possession. Perhaps they do not even know themselves the value of the contents of their manuscripts on account of their great ignorance. The dispersion of the eclectic school had become the fondest hope of the Christians. It had been overlooked for and contemplated with intense anxiety. It was finally achieved. The members were scattered by the hand of monsters. Theophilus, Bishop of Alexandria, and his nephew, Cyril, the murderer of the young, the learned, and the innocent Hypatia. With the death of the martyred daughter of Theon, the mathematician, there remained no possibility for the Neoplatonists to continue their school at Alexandria. During the lifetime of the youthful Hypatia, her friendship and influence with Orestes, the governor of the city, had assured the philosophers security and protection against their murderous enemies. With her death, they had lost their strongest friend. How much she was revered by all who knew her for her erudition, noble virtues, and character, we can infer from the letters addressed to her by Synesius, Bishop of Ptolemais, fragments of which have reached us. "My heart yearns for the presence of your divine spirit," he wrote in 1413 A.D., "which more than anything else could alleviate the bitterness of my fortunes." At another time he says, "O my mother, my sister, my teacher, my benefactor, my soul is very sad. The recollection of my children I have lost is killing me. When I have news of you and learn, as I hope, that you are more fortunate than myself, I am at least only half unhappy." What would have been the feelings of the most noble and worthy of Christian bishops, who had surrendered family and children and happiness for the faith into which he had been attracted, had a prophetic vision disclosed to him that the only friend that had been left to him, his mother, sister, benefactor, would soon become an unrecognizable mass of flesh and blood, pounded to jelly under the blows of the club of Peter the Reader, that her youthful, innocent body would be cut to pieces, the flesh scraped from the bones by oyster shells, and the rest of her cast into the fire, by order of the same Bishop Cyril he knew so well. Cyril, the canonized saint. There has never been a religion in the annals of the world with such a bloody record as Christianity. All the rest, including the traditional fierce fights of the chosen people with their next of kin, the idolatrous tribes of Israel, pale before the murderous fanaticism of the alleged followers of Christ. Even the rapid spread of Mohammedanism before the conquering sword of the Islam prophet is a direct consequence of the bloody riots and fights among Christians. It was the intestine war between the Nestorians and Cyrilians that engendered Islamism, and it is in the convent of Basra that the prolific seed was first sown by Bahira, the Nestorian monk. Freely watered by rivers of blood, the tree of Mecca has grown, till we find it in the present century overshadowing nearly 200 millions of people. The recent Bulgarian atrocities are but the natural outgrowth of the triumph of Cyril and the Mariolators. The cruel, crafty politician, the plotting monk, glorified by ecclesiastical history with the aureole of a martyred saint. The despoiled philosophers, the Neoplatonists, and the Gnostics, daily anathematized by the Church all over the world for long and dreary centuries. The curse of the unconcerned deity hourly invoked in the Magian rites and theurgic practice, and the Christian clergy themselves using sorcery for ages. Hypatia, the glorious maiden philosopher, torn to pieces by the Christian mob, and such as Catherine de Medici, Lucretia Borgia, Joan of Naples, and the Isabellas of Spain, presented to the world as the faithful daughters of the Church, some even decorated by the Pope with the Order of the Immaculate Rose, the highest emblem of womanly purity and virtue, a symbol sacred to the Virgin Mother of God. Such are the examples of human justice. How far less blasphemous appears a total rejection of Mary as an immaculate goddess than an idolatrous worship of her accompanied by such practices. In the next chapter, we will present a few illustrations of sorcery as practiced under the patronage of the Roman Church. And so ends Part 2, Chapter 1, Part 2. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs and that I have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something I apologize for. I did not have a whole lot to add to this one today like I did yesterday. I try to talk about the things I know and I try not to talk about the things I don't. And most of this, again, was history more than practical application. I'm here to discuss in great detail the practical application part of it, but the history part of it, while interesting and I am learning, is not really all that relevant to the actual practical application. It is important to understand that Christianity is severely flawed in many, many ways, most of which I have outlined in the Unconventional Bible Study. And so we have not had a need to really discuss it so far yet, but I am anticipating digging in much, much more heartily as we go along into this particular series of studies. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, share, and a sub. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree. If it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. And if you have something else you would like to see me discuss in the manner that we are doing here, drop that in the comments as well. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pit Steak. Peace.